This week I'm joined by Wendy Liu. She's a software engineer and startup founder. She's the author of this book, Abolish Silicon Valley, How to Liberate Technology and Capitalism. So this book's a part memoir, part manifesto, but being a memoir, it's also, of course, a very personal book. So what were your ideas of Silicon Valley growing up?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me on the show. It's really nice to have the opportunity to talk about this book more with people who've enjoyed it. So I guess just to frame where I was coming from when I read the book, I wrote the book because I had become increasingly disillusioned by this idea of Silicon Valley I had in my mind. And in hindsight, the problem was this idea I had of Silicon Valley bore no resemblance to the actual Silicon Valley that existed in reality, right? Because, you know, when I was maybe 12 years old, I started programming, I started spending a lot of time on the internet. And through being part of that subculture, reading all these blog posts, talking to people who were also programmers and spent a lot of time online, I just had this image of a tech industry that was a meritocracy, and that was where people were working on really, really hard problems and doing really amazing things. And in my mind, there is this very clear pipeline from being someone who, liked computers and spent a lot of time on the internet to getting a job at like Google or something and just making a lot of money, but also making the world a better place. That was really crucial to my understanding of how the industry worked. And as I grew older, it was very clear that I was just, really, really naive. But even then, I still clung onto this idea that there was something beautiful about the industry, something worth saving, something that was misunderstood by people who were outsiders. And so even in, the mid 2010s, when there are all these stories going on about Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, Uber drivers, Amazon workers, all these things that made it seem like the tech industry wasn't as great as it claimed to be. Still, I think there's a part of me that just thought, well, they just don't understand. They don't understand this core of brilliance and of goodness at the heart of the industry. And I couldn't really define it, but it was just one of those things where, I had just been so immersed in this idea that I couldn't really let it go. And it took me quite a while, and it also took me this period of disillusionment with my own startup. So I founded a startup in 2014, and by 2016, it was dying. There was no future for it. And I think once I came to terms with that, it was easier for me to realize that, well, maybe the rest of the industry as a whole, maybe there's something about it that I didn't understand. And maybe I was projecting my own feelings of, wanting to be appreciated, wanting to be successful onto this industry as a whole, which, was made up by people who didn't see things the same way as me, and who were also part of a bigger system that didn't actually care about the dreams and aspirations of the people involved. And there are all these other factors. And so, yeah, I don't know if this answers your question, but, for me, Silicon Valley, when I was a kid anyway, it was just this wonderful land of unicorns and meritocracy, where the smart kids, the people who were nerds in high school, would go on to make a lot of money and really just like get one over everyone else.
Can you talk about your experience of being a woman in the tech world? Did you find that Silicon Valley was a male-dominated environment?
Definitely. And I think that's one of the aspects of the book that I would have liked to flesh out more. But at the time I was writing it, I just couldn't figure out how to kind of expand it. But definitely, when I was spending a lot of time on the internet as a teenager, it was very, very clear to me what the kind of rules of the game were. And for a while, I actually hid my identity. I, just adopted a gender neutral username. People had no idea my age, my gender, my race, or anything. I was just like kind of a nameless avatar. And that worked for me because it was very clear that the gender dynamics in that space were just really weird. And when you had a place where everyone was kind of presumed to be male, I was involved in this one open source community, open source software community, where it was, 90-something% male among the contributors. And people definitely addressed me as sir a few times. And I'd be like, yeah, I guess I won't correct them. It's easier. And the more time I spent kind of immersed in that subculture, the more clear it became that, oh, well, women are just assumed to be inferior for whatever reason. I remember seeing a discussion forum, a discussion post on a forum about this woman who had some small degree of success with her startup. And, you know, all these people commenting on the post were talking about her appearance and how she was just clearly stupid and she must have slept her way to the top, something like that. And that kind of set the tone for me. There were a lot of things in that vein, ranging from, you know, just really overtly bad to just more kind of like making jokes about how women belong in the kitchen, that sort of thing. And as a teenager, someone, you know, who just didn't really understand how to deal with this, I think I like responded in a way that in hindsight was pretty destructive. And I thought, well, oh, that's just other women. I'm not like that. And I can figure out a way to exist in this space that avoids those stereotypes. And, you know, maybe this is good for me. Maybe it means that people will have low expectations of me and then I'll be fine. It never occurred to me that this was this, you know, more insidious systemic thing that was, even if it didn't affect me personally as much as it could have, you know, eventually I realized, wow, this is actually pretty horrible. And as I spent more time in these communities and also met people in real life who were, you know, women in tech, it really just, I think I kind of went around it the other way and realized, oh, this is actually a big problem. Because at first I kind of coped with it by thinking, this is not a big problem. You know, sure, there's like a weird culture, but the women who are complaining about it, they're just kind of blowing it out of proportion. But then over the course of my career, as I started paying more attention to, you know, stories of sexual harassment, sexual assault, even within the tech industry, then it just felt to me like, oh, there's like a massive problem. And it was very disheartening to see the way very, very prominent figures in the tech industry, you know, male, like, sorry, I'm saying this wrong. It was really, really, really disheartening to see that these male venture capitalists, founders, idols in the tech industry who I'd previously looked up to they were saying things like, oh, this is not important, or they were just basically finding excuses for the way the tech industry treated especially women, but all other sorts of people who are marginalized. And yeah, and it was just, I think that was one of those moments of reckoning for me where I thought, well, this subculture that I thought was so wonderful, it's actually not really. There are a lot of the people who I revered, they're just not that emotionally mature, and they don't have the same kind of moral framework that I do.
And you take up an internship at Google, and you interestingly described the experience as cult-like. Now, what did you find there?
Yeah, I think that's actually a fairly common way of describing Google. You know, there have been movies made about how cult-like the experience is. I think, yeah, it was weird. In hindsight, it was not that different from a lot of other tech companies. At the same time, I think Google had, definitely in the early 2010s, they had this particular aura about them, and they were really trying to play up this idea that they were different and that they were more fun, more, I don't know, just weird than other companies. And that, you know, that was part of their brand. And so they have this idea of something called googliness, where they will only hire you if you have a certain degree of googliness. What is googliness? No one really knows. It's like, are you a good fit for Google? Well, they just have this like black box algorithm that, you know, the recruiters just like look at you. They're like, yeah, this person's googly. It's a really bizarre system. It doesn't have much bearing in reality. But the company as a whole, I mean, what made them feel cult-like to me was the fact that they had just invested so much time and money and energy into trying to make their recruits feel like they're part of something much bigger, and that they were actually a part of it, when, you know, in reality, if you're an intern, if you're a low-level employee at Google, you have no say over anything. The amount of shares you own, if any, are tiny compared to the amount the founders own. But they really tried to cultivate this whole, we're a family, you know, you should be really proud to work here. You're one of the lucky few. So many people apply to work here, but you are amazing. That's why you're here. And there's also this cult of secrecy, I guess you can call that. You weren't supposed to leak anything, which in a sense is like obvious, but at the same time, Google just was quite secretive about a lot of projects for reasons that didn't necessarily seem clear to me. You know, there'd be something working on, something that some team inside Google would be working on, and the press was not supposed to know about it. But if you were an employee at Google, even at like a low-level intern, you could find out about it. You could read all the internal discussions about it. and you just weren't supposed to tell anyone. And this was hit home for me midway through my internship when someone was fired for leaking something, which wasn't actually a big deal at all. It was really just super minor. I think there was a story in some small tech publication about a project that Google was working on, and it wasn't even a negative story. It wasn't like, look at this horrible thing. It was more like, here's the scoop we got on something interesting that Google's working on. And, you know, inside Google, they managed to find out who it was. They're very good at that. They're very good at finding information at Google. It's kind of their whole thing. And this person was fired. And during one of our weekly town hall meetings, the founders explained that this person had been fired. And so that definitely made me feel a little uncomfortable, because I was thinking, well, I mean, first of all, the guys on the stage, they're billionaires, and they're just like kind of joking about this low-level employee who got fired and telling everyone his name, and just telling everyone that he had done something wrong. And we're all supposed to be like, oh, that's great, congrats, right? And there's just a very strange atmosphere, and I didn't really know how to feel about it, because it did not seem to me like this guy had done anything really wrong. And it also seemed like, well, if the internal workings of Google are supposed to be kept secret, then how are we supposed to know if we're doing the right thing? Because it didn't seem like there was that much internal discussion of it. And I certainly didn't trust, you know, the lack of diversity at Google. Like, there's the fact that you don't have that many people who are women, who are people of color, who are people from marginalized backgrounds making these decisions. And so how are we supposed to trust anything to be kept to account if it's just the same, you know, rich white men at the top making all these decisions?
And you touched on it at the start in your introduction, but what did you learn about the concept of meritocracy? Did you find that it was a myth?
I learned that it is actually an old concept, and it was coined as a satire, essentially. And yeah, it's, oh my God, this is one of those things that I find just so funny, because I genuinely believed that it was, one, that it was a good thing, and two, that it was just a tech industry thing. Like, I really thought that it was something that people had invented because of the tech industry. And I think part of the reason I believed that was because there is a strong reference to the term in many tech spaces. People use it as if, people use it probably not knowing the actual history of the term, and like the fact that it was coined not as a good thing, but to kind of describe what the elites told themselves. But, you know, I remember there's this one tech company that I revered and that I really wanted to work at, which made a rug. I think it said, "In meritocracy we trust," or something. And it was like, you know, it was bad. Like, they really believed that it was meritocracy, and this is a company that was, as you can imagine, about as diverse as your typical tech company, maybe worse in some ways. And not long after that, you know, someone, a female employee of the company, accused the founder and others at the company of just gender-based discrimination and other issues. But, you know, at the time, I think there was a period in maybe the early 2010s, maybe like even late 2000s, when a lot of people entering the tech industry could genuinely wholeheartedly believe that there is a such thing as a meritocracy, which was good, and that the tech industry was one. This is definitely true for me and a lot of people in my cohort, where it was just so easy to believe this idea that the tech industry didn't care who you were, where you're from, as long as you're like good at what you do based on some definition that was neutral, then you would rise to the top. That was something that I personally clung on to from a pretty young age, because I love this idea that because I genuinely believed myself to be, I don't know, very good at certain things that I was not being recognized for, and that, okay, well, you know, I'm not having a great time right now, like at school. I don't have a lot of friends. I don't have a lot of validation in other parts of my life, but I'm doing well at school, and maybe one day I'll get a great job in the tech industry and I'll be like recognized. And I think this is something that drives a lot of people who go on to become successful in the tech industry. There's this idea that there's this neutral way of assessing merit, and that the people at the top are the ones who have it. They just have merit. You know, you can't be mad at the fact that they have $200 million. They're just like really, really good. So yeah, and then later I learned that, oh, this is actually a very old idea, definitely predates the tech industry. People on Wall Street also talked about meritocracy, even, you know, before, during, and after the 2008 financial crisis. There's this idea that Wall Street was better as an industry than the rest of corporate America, specifically because they didn't care what your race was, what your gender was, where you came from, as long as you were really good at, I don't know, manipulating numbers or whatever they did. And then, you know, as I started reading more social science, then I recognized that, oh, this is a term that has been in use for a while, and that it was actually coined by this like a British author, kind of in satire, right? Just saying like, this is what the elites think. The elites think that they have a meritocracy, that the reason they're at the top is because they're the best, and that there isn't like, it would be naive to think that there is such a thing as a good meritocracy in practice, partly because like you can't have a system of assessing merit within this larger system that is extremely biased. Like you can't do this very well. And at the same time, there is no neutral definition of merit. You can't just say like, this person's good, this person's not. Like, well, what are you basing that on, and how are you deciding what is good and what is not? So, you know, eventually I realized that this is actually not a useful term, and I discarded any attempts to try to valorize that. But it's hard, because I think there is something ingrained, definitely ingrained in me, but also ingrained in a lot of people in this industry and others, that meritocracy is good, and that if we just had a meritocracy, then everything would be okay.
No, you're definitely right. It's a curious history, the history of the term. It was Michael Young, wasn't it, in 1958, who came up with the term. I also want to ask about, I thought it was really interesting, you raised a point about Google workers, and they weren't unionized, and they had this perception that, you know, we're not factory workers, we're not miners, we shouldn't have the same protection. Now, did you see that as like a broader trend of exploitation in Silicon Valley?
No, definitely not. Yeah, and I think just to kind of expand on that a bit more, unionizing was never a thing that I'd heard anyone talk about. It just didn't seem relevant, right? It was like, oh, it's a thing that people used to do back in the old ages when things were really bad. But like, we're part of a different class of people. Like, this is just a completely different era with different rules. And, you know, the things that we're doing as workers at Google, we're not really like workers. We're not doing jobs with bosses. I mean, like, technically we have bosses, but it's different, you know? Yeah, and I think that's, this is something that it was always kind of like a compromise, and that there are always elements of being even a high-tech worker that are closer to being like a factory worker or a coal miner than people would admit. But it's in the last few years where this the contradictions are really starting to come out. But you know, at the time when I was at Google in 2013, I had never really heard any of this talk around unionizing, around contractors. I think this is the big thing that has been making the tech industry talk about unions in a way that it never really has had to for a while. And it's the fact that a lot of these big tech companies, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, they all have massive contractor workforces, you know, to say nothing of, say, like Amazon, which has a very clear divide between the well-paid white-collar workers and then, you know, the workers who are drivers or warehouse workers who are certainly not paid as well. But yeah, in recent years, I think people are talking about unions in a way that just, I had never conceived of that possibility when I was working there. It really felt to me like I was part of a different thing that had nothing to do with unions, and I had never learned anything about labor history. Right? It's not a thing that I really come into contact with. It was never clear to me that it mattered, and so I definitely at the time I did not think of software engineering work or any kind of work that was like well paid like that as work. It didn't feel to me like it had anything to do with I don't know, whatever drove people to form unions when they were working in factories or anything.
I think it's really interesting, the juxtaposition between the beginning of the book and then the latter parts of the book. So you talk about at McGill, it's a really political university, but you didn't actually get involved in much of the activism. And then later on in your life, when you get to London, you discover all this literature and all these great people that inspired you as well. Now, I want to ask: do you think the tech world forced you to suppress that political activism? Did you feel that it was quite an insular culture and it didn't encourage political discourse really?
I definitely think that's true. I think in my specific case, it was less the environment I was in and just who I was, and the fact that, I mean, who I was definitely a reflection to some degree of the environment that I spent my time in. But at the same time, there's something about me and just the way I saw the world that made me not want to do political activism. And, you know, even if I had been surrounded by people who were doing that sort of thing, like as I was in McGill, it just didn't seem interesting to me. I guess um, at that point, like up until a few years ago, really, I had not seen just the world as a whole as something that could be contested and that should be challenged. So yeah, but at the same time, I think the culture is changing right now, and there are definitely pockets of the tech industry that are more open to political activism. There are some very, very politically active people in the tech industry right now, but yeah, there's still, unfortunately, there is a pretty strong culture of just putting your head down and just doing your job. um, this idea that like you shouldn't do politics at work because you should just come here to work. And I think this is unfortunately a resistance that like a lot of people who've been trying to unionize or just otherwise do some sort of workplace organizing in tech have had to put up with, where you have people who are saying like, well, I like what you're doing in theory, but like that's just politics and I just want to do my job. And it's like you can kind of understand where they're coming from, and that's definitely something that I would have understood a lot more a few years ago. I think now I'm at a point where I think like, well, everything's just so broken. Like, how can you look around and think that things are okay? So, but yeah, it's tricky, and I think where that impulse really comes down to at the end of the day, like among people in the tech industry who don't like the idea of political activism, I think it's just like thinking that things are kind of fine the way they are, and that it's not necessary to do anything to really challenge it, or that it's just not worth it. Like it's just not, there's no point because it won't change anything. And I can kind of see the latter, but I think the former is, I don't really believe that anymore. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to me personally, like when I was watching the Red Squares, which is the anti-student tuition fee, the tuition fee rise like protests, I just didn't think that it made any sense. I was like, well, I really bought into this whole idea of like fiscal neutrality or whatever. The government was saying like, well, we must raise tuition fees so that we can pay off our bills or something. And I thought, okay, that seems good. Yeah, run the government like a household. Makes sense. I just did not think about it too hard.
So the book's called Abolish Silicon Valley. What do you mean by those three words?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things where it comes from a particular kind of like joke that I made on Twitter. And that itself came from a time a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago at this point, I don't remember, when people were talking about abolishing ICE, abolishing profit, abolishing everything. And this is actually way before the current wave of talking about abolition in the context of prisons. But I just made a joke at one point. It's like, well, if we're going to abolish like these things, we should just abolish Silicon Valley too. And then people seem to like that joke. And then it just got a lot of steam. And when I was talking to Repeater Books about doing a book, I suggested, well, like this is kind of this joke title that's been going around my head, and they loved it. And so I was like, oh, I guess this is the title of my book now. And I've kind of gone through ups and downs of like regretting it versus like thinking that it was actually a good title. I think right now, just looking around at the world, I mean, just yes, abolish everything. But what specifically I mean by abolishing Silicon Valley is it's, it is a joke. It is kind of just like a provocative title, but it's also just a call to reimagine what the world could look like. Because when I say abolish, I mean in the way that a lot of radical writers have used the term abolish, like abolishing private property, abolishing profit. It's not about just I don't know, like in the case of Silicon Valley, it's not about just like bulldozing all the buildings that make up Silicon Valley. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about reimagining the whole world order such that the things that we associate with Silicon Valley no longer exist. And I'm talking about billionaires. I'm talking about the private ownership of the means of production, especially when it comes to digital gateways. I'm talking about a system where you have all these people who are being paid tons of money to work on things that are not actually good for humanity as a whole and might even be destructive, working on apps that are addictive, working on ways to make work more miserable for other workers. And I think this is, the thing about this is that none of this is unique to Silicon Valley. It's not like I'm saying Silicon Valley is the source of all the evils. It's more that I think of Silicon Valley as reflective of the worst tendencies in capitalism and what's special about it. The reason it occupies such a large place in our culture and in our minds is because it has so much money, is because it is able to scale so quickly that, you know, you can have someone like Jeff Bezos going from just really like a, you know, unknown random hedge fund guy to being the world's wealthiest person within a few decades. And that is pretty special. And I think that's, unfortunately, whatever the utopians might think Silicon Valley should be, that is what Silicon Valley is. You know, the purpose of the system is what it does. And what Silicon Valley has done is that it has concentrated wealth, it has concentrated power, it has remade our world in such a way that so many people are dependent on what is happening in a few tech companies that are mostly, you know, multinational and don't pay taxes and just treat their workers horribly. And so, yeah, and I think when the reason I wanted to talk about abolishing Silicon Valley as a system and not just say like, oh, well, there are some bad things about Silicon Valley and we should make it better. It's because I don't think there is a way to actually make it better in a substantial way without tackling capitalism as a whole, without tackling the larger economic system that has given Silicon Valley all its power. And so it's a bit of a subtle point. Like, I'm sure there are people who see the title of the book and they're like, ugh, another person who hates tech. I'm like, I don't hate tech, right? Like I love tech. I'm still, writing code right now. Like I currently working, is doing tech stuff for a nonprofit, and I love building things. And I love the fact that there is this community of people who also love building software. But what I hate is just what it has become under capitalism. I hate the fact that all this technology that could actually be more open, could be more helpful, is instead monopolized by these few corporations that are then owned by billionaires who are just really like, I mean, if you like at a time like this, when all these people are unemployed, when so many people are dying, when people are being evicted, and the fact that you have someone who's worth $200 billion, it's just like, I just don't see how anyone could see that's okay. But yeah, so the call to abolition for me is just like, you know, kind of in the same way that other thinkers who've used the term abolition for centuries, is just like, how do we imagine a radically different world? One where the thing that we think of as Silicon Valley just doesn't exist because it doesn't have to, because we don't need this very commercialized, centralized way of creating technology. And instead we have something that's a little more egalitarian, a little more decentralized, a little more open.
You also make the point that we tend to focus on individuals in Silicon Valley. So Zuckerberg, Larry Page. Now, why do you think that's the case? And we fail to look at the systemic factors that you've been talking about just then?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is hard. And I think there are a lot of people who, the people who construct the narratives about these, you know, tech billionaires and whatever, maybe some of them, you know, think otherwise, but I think a lot of them don't actually think that the system as a whole needs to be challenged. And so it is quite convenient to just have a story about Mark Zuckerberg being uniquely bad and how he's just, this guy is just horrible. If we just got rid of him, then maybe Facebook would be better, without thinking of like, what are the systemic reasons? What are the incentives that would make anyone in his position behave that way? Maybe not to the same degree, but like, are there these, you know, larger structural forces that are conditioning the way that people behave within this industry? And I really think in this case that with Facebook, for example, with Uber, with Amazon, you can't entirely just say like, oh, it is the fact of these founders just being really horrible people. I think these people, they're actually very good at what they do. Like Jeff Bezos is extremely good at being the perfect CEO, the perfect entrepreneur. He's doing exactly what capitalism incentivizes people to do. And in that case, then if you were to swap him out with someone who's a little less ruthless, someone who is, you know, more compassionate, kinder, they just wouldn't be very good, right? Like shareholders would not be happy. Can you imagine swapping out Jeff Bezos with someone who's just like really, really nice to all their workers and just actually wanted to pay them a living wage? Shareholders would revolt. They would say like, what is this? This is not what I signed up for. I signed up for a company that is brutally exploitative and has, dreams of world domination. And so I think we have to look more at this system that has allowed men like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg to flourish. And what are these factors that mean that if you replace them with someone else, whoever replaced them would have to act in functionally the same way. And maybe they would put a spin on it. Maybe they'd be better at PR or something. But I mean, if you look at the case of Uber, I think that's pretty instructive, where the original founder that everyone was talking about, Travis Kalanick, he was replaced with someone else who was seen as more professional, more businesslike. And what is Uber doing there? Are they doing anything different when it comes to the way they're treating their workers? No, you could say that it's gotten worse in precisely the way you'd expect it to. They are still refusing to recognize that their workers should be paid better. Even in California, where there was a law passed, the bill that was passed earlier this year that basically said that Uber and other gig companies had to treat their workers as employees, and that they were in fact, they have been employees under the law this whole time, but that Uber was just refusing to treat them that way. Even then, Uber is still pouring millions and millions of dollars into overturning that, as opposed to just treating their workers the way they should. And so I think, I get really frustrated when criticism of the tech industry boils down to this person is bad, this billionaire is bad. Like, of course, all billionaires are bad, but also like, you replace them with another person who will also be a billionaire, they will also do the same things, right? Like, I just don't understand how you could expect anything different when the systemic factors are in place. And I think this is a problem of a lot of tech feminism, the whole like Sheryl Sandberg, lean in feminism sort of area of critique, where you have a lot of people in tech who are essentially saying that the problem with tech is that there are just too many men involved, right? Just replace them with women. And no, that's not the end of the story. There have been a lot of stories about tech companies, or just like companies that have a sort of tech feel, run by women, that also end up reproducing some pretty harmful behavior. And it's not necessarily that these women are also bad, that they just chose the wrong people. I think there's something more structural, that the way these companies have to operate in order to provide a return for their investors is just predicated on treating people badly. You kind of have to, and of doing things that others would consider unethical. This is just the kind of culture in the industry. And so, I guess I would be very, very happy if people would just stop doing like these in-depth profiles of all these tech founders, and instead would just like try to connect the dots a little more, because I think we already know enough about how these billionaires work, and like, they're not that interesting. They're just normal people who have been thrust into the limelight and showered with money. We're not going to gain any insights from like looking at the workings of their brains or whatever. It's just, we have to understand that the problems partly arise from putting fairly ordinary people into these dramatically exaggerated positions of power without the accountability that should come with that power.
And what do you think we've learned with the coronavirus pandemic? Because we've seen companies such as Zoom, which we're using now, their profits have gone up markedly, and at the other end, gig workers are some of the they've got a high risk of contracting coronavirus and suffering from it. So do you think that's do you think it just proves what you've just been saying there about the inequalities inherent within capitalism?
Yeah, I think the inequalities have always been there. And what the pandemic has done, it's made them very clear. It's made them worse. And it's done so in ways that are, they're like interesting. That's not necessarily trivial. I don't think we could have necessarily predicted how this would have happened. But at the same time, the fact that there are some workers who are being left out in the dust, they're in the US, like the amount of just benefits that they're getting, the unemployment insurance that they're getting, protections from evictions that they're getting, it's not enough. It's nowhere near enough. And it's actually really, really just horrifying to watch and to look around and see what's happening to millions of people they just have no recourse. And and I think what this pandemic is proving is that we have a socioeconomic political system that is built to serve a very small number of people and for a very small number of purposes. And like, it's not, and we all know this, of course, right? Like it's even inherent in the name, capitalism. What is the goal? What does capitalism do? Who does it serve? It serves those who own capital. And that was always true. It's not like the pandemic has really done anything that new. It's more just that it has revealed and accelerated some things that were kind of there all along. And so looking at the way Silicon Valley has been affected, you know, in a sense, this is all too predictable, where you have white collar workers, people who can work from home, they're just working remotely, and they're fine for the most part. You know, it's not necessarily great, but at least they still have their jobs. But then you have workers who are just getting laid off and don't necessarily have another job that they can apply for. And then you have people who are still being made to go to work in these very unsafe conditions. But I mean, actually, just to go back to my earlier point on white collar workers, some of them are getting laid off. And that's something that I think it would be quite surprising to some. But there are historical precedents, of course, during the dot-com crash in the early 2000s. A lot of tech workers who previously thought that they were immune, they got laid off. And it happens. And I guess my hope is that as these larger economic circumstances reveal to these, you know, white collar workers that they're not immune from the vicissitudes of capitalism, that maybe it'll get them to kind of throw their lot in with all these other workers who are also not immune and who are, you know, even more unprotected. So that's kind of my hope. But like, I mean, it's unfortunate that it has to take like this horrific situation for people to have that realization. But at the same time, I'm thinking, like, for myself, if my startup had not failed the way it did, I don't know if I would have started thinking critically about the tech industry, right? Because like if my startup had been super successful, let's say, like I'd made like a ton of money and, you know, I kept like failing upward or whatever, then I probably would be pretty uncritical about this industry, at least like not critical about it in, you know, this like kind of abolitionist sense. So I don't know. I think it's tough. I think when you're in a bubble where everything's working out great for you, it's really hard to accept the possibility that the whole system is actually broken, and that the fact that other people are not doing so well is not their fault, but the way the system was designed. So, and I think this applies to a lot of things, from, you know, from the tech industry to just pretty much like everything. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. I went off on a bit of a tangent, sorry.
And it's really interesting. You talk about it features quite a lot actually. The election of Donald Trump in 2016, and Silicon Valley was often presented as this liberal, quite progressive part of California, and they would be resistant to Trump when he was elected. But you say it was business as usual. Now, God forbid that he gets elected again. But do you think a similar response would happen again? Yeah.
I think, you know, some of these leaders might put up a show. They might like tweet really angrily about how this is subverting democracy, but I don't know. I think they'll be okay, right? I guess that's, at the end of the day, that is probably what they're considering. Like, am I still going to be able to make money? Am I still going to be able to have the kind of power I'm accustomed to? And I think it feels like very, very possible to me that Trump could get elected, and that the people who had maybe like complained loudly about it before, well, they'll just be like, all right, this is just how things are. You know, and in a sense, you can't really blame them. That is what their incentives are under the system.
Yeah, and Joe Biden's criticized the big tech industry, but he's also hired some people on his team who are from Apple and Silicon Valley companies. Now, do you think he would take a more hawkish line on big tech, or do you just see a continuation of what's happened before?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you know, who knows what could happen? Like in 2019, no one could have predicted what 2020 would look like. It is very possible that he will do something surprising, but at the same time, I think my kind of guess is that he's not going to be more progressive than Obama was, right? Like Obama chose him partly because he was like a moderate, and you know, Biden was always to the right of at least what people thought Obama was, and so Obama was just so cozy with the tech companies. You know, some of his staffers, like they've gone on to work for Uber and Lyft and whatever, and it's just like, I really don't see how Biden could take a hard line against these tech companies unless there was like a very strong popular movement forcing him to do so. Similar to what we have now with the, you know, the movement against police brutality. I think if there's something like that, and if it were expressed in a way that were difficult to ignore, then maybe the Biden presidency would take a hard line against certain tech companies. But I don't think there's anything about his presidency that would challenge capitalism in like a much more substantial way, because that's just not part of his platform. And, you know, unless there's actually some external force that's like making him do that, I don't really see how that could happen. But still, you know, maybe there might be some moves from the Department of Justice or something around antitrust. I think that these conversations have been heating up, and the way that workers are treated, like by gig economy companies and by Amazon and companies like that. There might be some moves there, but, you know, I definitely don't think it's something that Biden himself is going to make a move for. I think whatever he does will be a response to demands from workers, from activists, and others.
Okay, you used the phrase entrepreneurship for non-capitalist ends. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think entrepreneurship is kind of a cool idea in concept, and it is a shame that, you know, the concept has been so besmirched by Silicon Valley. And the way that here we have entrepreneurship as in you have someone who went to Stanford and raises like $10 million for their mobile gaming app that will just make kids do microtransactions or whatever. And that is what passes as entrepreneurship in the Valley. And that is a massive shame, because I think the core idea of entrepreneurship is that you start with nothing and then you build something up, and it requires people who are very dedicated and who believe in what they do and who are able to scale in such a way that they can make an impact on people's lives. And I think if you take that idea and apply it towards things that the world actually needs, rather than what investors think will make them money, then, you know, I think that you've got something really interesting, because entrepreneurship is, let's see, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. Feel free to cut this out if you have time. But yeah, I think it is horrific to see how you have all these people who are just raising so much money for what they call entrepreneurship, when really what they're doing is it's not interesting. It's not socially beneficial to anyone. It's only really good for their investors and for their own egos. So I would love to see a more kind of like a radically reoriented idea of entrepreneurship that is founded on the idea of actually meeting people's needs, which is what it claims to be doing. And that's the thing. Like, there's a massive gap between the rhetoric and the reality. And you have people who are saying like, oh, I'm an entrepreneur, which means I build things that help people. It's like, no, you're not. You're really not. And it's hard to kind of diagnose like what is a good instance of entrepreneurship and what is a bad instance when we're within this for-profit system, where the only actual barometer at the end of the day is, will this make money? Will this make, you know, my investors back their capital? Will it give them a return in like 5 years? I just don't think that is a good measurement. I think that is actually at odds with what is actually socially beneficial to the vast majority of people.
Okay, I appreciate you've got a lot of commitments and you're busy, so I'll finish with this one. You make the point that abolition's not just for abolition's sake. You want something better to fill the void. Now, you've talked about it throughout the interview, but just to finish, what would you like to see fill that void, and how optimistic are you that that can be fulfilled?
Yeah, so to give some kind of context on that, the way I think about abolition has been very much influenced by like prison abolition, police abolition arguments, where you know, when people talk about abolishing prisons, they're not just saying open all the doors to the prisons tomorrow and keep everything else the same. The whole point of it is to build a society where prisons are not needed. In fact, prisons, you know, would feel weird. Like it's just really changing the way everything else operates too. And so, you know, in the case of Silicon Valley, it's like, well, let's think about a world where people don't need to become billionaires to be able to work on something that matters, to be able to work on something that they believe in, and, you know, to try to build something from scratch. And also a world where everyone has a decent standard of living, where it's like you don't have to be an Uber driver or like a gig worker just to be able to pay your rent. Because I think that is the argument that these companies make, that like, oh, we're giving workers the flexibility they need to pay their bills. And it's like, well, let's imagine a world where you don't have to do that kind of work just to be able to survive. And then when it comes to technology as a whole, I think there's something really tragic about the fact that you have all this technology that is locked up within these private corporations, and they're the ones who get to decide what to do with it, even though it's, you know, it's not the shareholders who put in the work to make that happen. It's all the people who were employed to work on it, from the software engineers, designers, to the people who are doing work that's not usually thought of as tech work, like the content moderators, or Amazon mechanical turkers, or anyone who's doing any kind of work that generates data that's fed into an algorithm. I think all of this, all of the technology that we kind of take for granted around us was built by a lot of people in all these different roles. And unfortunately, the way it's owned right now is just it's owned by a company that is, you know, the biggest shareholders, like some billionaire. And I think that is a huge shame, because what we're seeing is a mismatch between the way that these products are produced and the way they're owned, which doesn't actually make sense, and which is definitely not conducive to societal well-being. So I would like to see a world where we have much more democratic, egalitarian ownership of, you know, technology, and really just everything, the means of production in general. But I think if you look at technology, it feels especially egregious, because a lot of the technology that these private corporations rely on is actually open source and is actually, or public domain, and it was created by people who believed in this idea of a commons, and instead they're kind of taking advantage of that and using it to build these billion-dollar businesses.